My husband handed me the divorce papers in the equipment barn on a Wednesday afternoon in August, with his brother Hector watching, and said, "This offer is more than fair, more than you contributed." The folder had a number on the cover sheet. $312,000 for 17 years. I did not take the pen. Hector laughed, a short, quiet laugh, the kind men make when a woman doesn't move fast enough. What neither of them knew was that in my home office there was a fireproof box, and in that box was a recorded senior water rights deed in my sole name, covering the well field their $8 million sale could not close without. The appraiser's figure on the deed was $3.9 million. I had never mentioned it. Good day, dear listeners. It's Sienna again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. People always say that a quiet woman is an agreeable woman. I want to offer you a different explanation. In the San Joaquin Valley, a quiet woman is often just a woman who has read the purchase agreement. She has decided not to share what she found on page 31. I had been agreeable for 17 years because agreeable is efficient, not because I lacked an opinion. 30 years of working with numbers had taught me something no certification program states outright, but every careful bookkeeper eventually understands it. The most consequential instrument in any transaction is the one that has not yet been disclosed. What I held in that fireproof box was not a weapon I had sharpened. It was simply a record I had kept, the way I kept all records, accurately, unhurried, filed under the correct category. The category, in this case, was my own name. What the Strickland family had never understood about me, what Desmond had never once thought to wonder, was that my name appeared on more than their account's payable ledger. It appeared on a deed at the Fresno County Recorder's office. It had appeared there for 12 years. And on the Wednesday afternoon when Desmond held out that pen in the equipment barn, surrounded by the smell of diesel and dried alfalfa, and the particular heat that settles into corrugated metal walls by 2 o'clock in August, he was asking me to sign away 17 years without knowing that he needed something from me that was not yet on the table. He had miscounted. Badly. I was 46 years old when the barn meeting happened. I had been a bookkeeper since I was 19. That is a fact about me that has never changed with the marriage or the zip code. I hold a bookkeeping certification that I renewed every 2 years, without fail, even during the years when my official title at the Strickland operation was nothing at all. Not office manager, not financial administrator, not comptroller, though I functioned as all three. I had been filing the UST loan compliance forms since year 3 of the marriage. I managed the crop insurance claims, the accounts payable, the quarterly reconciliations for an operation that employed 30 seasonal workers at peak season, and ran through $500,000 in equipment loans in any given year. Nobody called it management. Nobody called it anything. That is not a grievance. It is a data point, and I am a person who deals in data points. The San Joaquin Valley in August is flat and pale gold. The air presses down at 104 degrees by noon. The irrigation pivots run in slow mechanical arcs over the cotton fields, visible from every window of the Kingsburg house and from the cab of the truck I drove between the fields and the county extension office and the accounting firm in Fresno, where I handled the quarterly filings. The Stricklands had never once asked me where I went on those drives. They were not interested in accounting. They were interested in land and the things that grew on it, and the money the things that grew on it produced. That was Desmond's entire frame. I understood it completely. I had been managing the numbers behind that frame for 17 years, which meant I understood it better than he did. in the way that the person who keeps the books always understands a business better than the person whose name is on the sign. The fireproof box sat on the second shelf of my home office, behind a stack of accordion folders that held 7 years of USDA filing copies. It was gray metal, roughly the size of a shoebox, with a combination lock I had set the day I brought it home from the hardware store in Reedley, the summer after Ernesto's estate closed. Inside it I had kept 2 categories of documents from the start: the certified copy of the water rights deed my uncle Ernesto had left me in his will 12 years earlier, and the annual Fresno County Recorder's renewal confirmation that the deed remained on record in my sole name. That was it. I did not keep anything else in that box. It was not a general storage solution. It was a specific repository for a specific instrument, and every year when the renewal confirmation arrived in the mail, I opened the box, placed the new confirmation on top of the previous year's, closed the lid, and turned the lock. 12 years of confirmations, 12 years of the same address on the deed. My name on every page. I should tell you something about my uncle, because the deed begins with him. Ernesto Calderon was my mother's older brother, and he had run a small, independent well field operation in Fresno County since the late 1970s. He was not a wealthy man in the way people use that word. He owned land that was not glamorous, a well field and the surrounding acreage, adjacent to what eventually became the eastern edge of the Strickland operation, when Desmond expanded in his mid-30s. Ernesto had drilled the original wells in 1981, during a period when the Strickland family land was still held by Desmond's father, and because Ernesto's wells predated the Strickland Jr. appropriations by 11 years. The water rights attached to those wells carried senior priority status under California law. That is a technical fact with enormous practical consequences. In a drought year, and the year Desmond chose to sell was a drought year, the 4th in 6, senior rights govern access to water before any junior appropriation receives a single gallon. Ernesto had understood what that meant. He had told me once, at a family barbecue in Reedley when I was in my early 30s and he was getting older, and had started talking about his affairs with more directness, that the deed was worth more than the land looked. The water is what's worth something, he had said, not the dirt. He died 14 months later. He left the well field and the deed to me in a clear, properly witnessed will, with no conditions and no ambiguity. My aunt Remedios, his wife, 71 now, sharp and deliberate, had been present the day the title transferred at the county recorder's office. She could describe the transaction from memory if you asked her to, which Xiomara eventually did. What I want you to understand is how ordinary the deed felt for the first several years I held it. It was a piece of recorded property, appraised at $410,000 in the year of Ernesto's death, significant but not dramatic. The well field produced water that I leased annually to a neighboring alfalfa grower for a modest fee, through an arrangement Ernesto had established, and that I had simply continued, because the paperwork was already in place, and continuing it required almost no work. I deposited the annual lease income. It ranged between $14,000 and $19,000 per year, depending on water conditions, into a separate account I held in my own name. Not because I was hiding it. I had a right to my own separate account. I simply never discussed it at the Strickland dinner table, because the Strickland dinner table discussions were about field operations and equipment costs and seasonal labor, not about my uncle's well field in Fresno County. No one asked. And I have never in my professional life volunteered information that wasn't asked for. That is not deception. That is precision. I want to tell you about the lease renewal the spring before everything changed, because it is part of the picture. In April of the year before the barn meeting, 14 months prior, The alfalfa grower who had been leasing the wellfield water rights for the previous 6 years informed me that he would not be renewing. He was reducing his acreage and his water draw, he said. He thanked me for a good arrangement and wished me well. I thanked him. I noted the end of the lease in the wellfield file I maintained separately from the Strickland operation records. I began making quiet inquiries through the water district contacts I had built over 12 years about the current demand for senior priority water access in Fresno County. What I found was that demand had risen sharply. 4 drought years had made senior rights a scarce and sought commodity. I was not planning anything. I was keeping records. I noted the market conditions in a memo to myself, dated April 15th, filed in the Wellfield folder. 14 months later, I was standing in an equipment barn not taking a pen. And the market conditions I had noted were relevant. The first sign arrived 8 months before the barn meeting. I processed it without disclosing it, which is what I did with most things. Desmond began taking calls from a number I did not recognize on his cell phone. That, by itself, is nothing. But I noticed the quality of attention he brought to those calls. The way he walked to the far end of the equipment yard, turned his back, spoke briefly, and returned with a particular set to his jaw. I knew that expression. It meant money conversations, not field problems, not equipment failures. Money. I had observed that expression for 17 years across kitchen tables and county extension meetings and bank loan appointments. I knew what it meant. I filed the observation without acting on it. Bookkeepers do not jump to conclusions from a single data point. They wait for the pattern. The second sign was documentary, and it arrived 3 months before the barn meeting through a folder I encountered in the course of ordinary file maintenance. The Strickland operation kept a shared network drive that I maintained. In early May, a new folder appeared in the top-level directory. The label read, Purchase, Preliminary. I opened it as part of my routine review. Inside was a 47-page draft purchase agreement from an agricultural conglomerate whose name I recognized from the business press. A large corporate farming operation that had been acquiring Central Valley acreage for several years. I read all 47 pages. On page 31, I found the wellfield boundary language. The draft described the sale parcel's eastern boundary in legal land description terms, and the description included, by precise coordinate reference, the acreage immediately adjacent to the Strickland operation's primary irrigation infrastructure, the acreage that matched, coordinate for coordinate. The well field described in my deed. The conglomerate's draft assumed the well field was included in the sale parcel. It was not. It had never been. It was in my name at the Fresno County Recorder's Office, 12 years running. I read page 31 twice. I printed it. I dated the printout in the margin, May 9th, and I put it in the fireproof box with the deed. Then I returned to my other work. I want to be honest with you, dear listeners, about what I thought in that moment. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel afraid. What I felt was the recognition of a problem that had a solution, and the solution was the document in the box. I had not put that document there with this moment in mind. I had put it there because it was mine, and it needed to be kept correctly. That it turned out to matter enormously, was not a plan I had executed. It was a consequence of 12 years of accurate record-keeping, which is, in the end, what bookkeeping is for. The barn meeting was staged, not spontaneous. I knew it from the moment I walked through the side door. Hector was already positioned near the far wall, standing rather than leaning, the posture of a man who has been told to be there, not the posture of a man who wandered in. Desmond had asked him to come. He wanted a witness. That told me the conversation was going to be formal. Desmond had rehearsed his version of it. The folder was already on the tractor hood when I arrived. The barn smelled of diesel and the specific dry sweetness of alfalfa cut in the adjacent field that morning. The light through the corrugated metal was yellow and dense afternoon valley heat, the kind that slows everything down except thought. Desmond picked up the folder and held it out to me. He said the offer was more than fair. He said it was more than I had contributed. He said that signing that day would save us both time and legal fees. He said for old time's sake with a sincerity that I believe was entirely genuine. That made the moment harder in a way I did not expect. Genuine men who have miscounted are still miscounting. He held out the pen. I looked at the pen for one moment. I did not take it. Hector made the sound, the brief, quiet laugh, barely a sound at all, more an exhale shaped like amusement. I said I would need to speak with an attorney. Desmond's expression shifted in a way I had not seen before. He looked surprised. He had expected me to reach for the pen. That look, the surprise, the recalibration happening in real time behind his eyes, told me everything I needed to know about what he had prepared for. He had not prepared for no. I set the folder on the tractor hood. I thanked him for meeting with me, and I walked back through the side door into the August heat. I drove to Fresno that evening. I had looked up agricultural and water rights attorneys on my phone during the drive. I had not needed to research the category. I knew the category existed because 12 years of managing an inherited water rights asset will teach you that whether you intend to learn it or not. I found Xiomara Ruiz's firm, listed among the top Fresno-based specialists in senior water rights priority disputes. Her office was closed when I arrived. I sat in the parking lot of that building for 20 minutes in the cooling truck, the valley sky going amber above the roofline. I called her office line and left a message that described in 3 sentences the nature of what I held and what was happening. Then I drove home to Kingsburg. I made dinner. I did not open the fireproof box that night. I knew exactly what was in it. I want you to understand what that drive home looked like on paper, what the numbers were, concretely, in the quiet of the truck cab. On one side, the folder on the tractor hood, with $312,000 on the cover sheet. 17 years. 30 seasonal workers managed annually. USTA compliance filed correctly, every quarter, without a single amendment. Crop insurance claims totaling what I knew to be over $2.4 million across the marriage. Every one of them approved on the first submission. On the other side, the deed in the fireproof box. The well field that Ernesto had drilled in 1981. The senior priority status that predated the Strickland Jr. appropriations by 11 years. The 47-page purchase agreement with the wellfield boundary language on page 31 that the conglomerate had drafted, assuming they were acquiring water rights they were not acquiring, because those rights were mine. I did not know Xiomara's number yet. I knew the deed number, the recording date, and my own name. That was enough to drive home on. That night, after dinner, I sat in the home office for a while, without turning on the overhead light. The room had a single window that faced east, not the irrigation pivots which faced west and south, but a neighbor's windbreak of eucalyptus trees that in the dark were just a darker mass against the valley sky. The fireproof box was on the shelf. I did not open it. I had been opening it once a year for 12 years, every time the renewal confirmation arrived, and I knew its contents precisely. What I did was sit and think through the sequence of events that would need to happen, in what order, with what documentation at each step. I am not a lawyer, but I had spent 17 years preparing documentation for a farm operation that was regularly subject to federal compliance review, and I understood the relationship between a claim and its evidentiary support. I listed the documents I would need to bring to the attorney. In my head, in order. Deed. Renewal confirmations. 12 years. The page 31 printout, dated the settlement folder Desmond had handed me in the barn. The Wellfield lease history, which was in a separate folder on my personal drive. The annual lease income records from the separate account. I went through the list twice. Then I went to bed. Do you know the first thing Ernesto ever said to me about paperwork? I was 11 years old, sitting at his kitchen table in Reedley on a Saturday, while he sorted through a set of county tax notices. He was not a man who talked while he worked, but that afternoon he set one document aside and looked at me and said, "A paper that is filed is a fact. A paper in your head is an opinion." He went back to his sorting. I was 11, and I did not fully understand what he meant until I was much older and had filed enough documents myself to feel the weight of the distinction. A fact in a filing cabinet does not require anyone to believe it. It simply is. The deed in the gray metal box on the shelf of my home office was a fact. $312,000 on the cover of a folder in an equipment barn was an opinion about what I was owed. Do you see the difference? The opinion depended on what Desmond knew. The fact did not depend on anyone. I thought about Ernesto again, sitting in that dark room, and about the barbecue in Reedley where he had told me the water was what was worth something, not the dirt. He had been right in a way he could not have fully anticipated. He could not have known that 12 years after his death, a corporate conglomerate would be building an $8 million agricultural acquisition around the assumption that they were buying water they were not buying. He could not have known any of that. What he could control was the deed. And the deed was recorded, and the recording was renewed, and the renewal was in the box. What he had left me was not just an asset. He had left me a lesson in the form of a document. Keep what is yours in the correct place. Know exactly what it says. Do not mistake proximity for ownership. The alfalfa grower next door is not the owner of the well. Xiomara called at 7 the following morning. I was in the home office, the fireproof box already on the desk, already open. I read her the deed description over the phone, slowly and exactly. The legal land description, the wellfield coordinates, the recording date, the document number at the Fresno County Recorder. When I finished, there was a pause. 4 seconds, which I counted. Then she said, "This is a senior priority right. Do you understand what that means for the sale?" I said I had read page 31. Another pause, shorter. She said, "Come in today." I drove to Fresno and sat across from Xiomara Ruiz in her office at 10 o'clock that morning, a room lined with district water maps and stacked priority records, air-conditioned to a temperature that felt, after the valley morning outside, like the inside of a library. Xiomara was early 40s, with a voice that moved faster than most people's thoughts. The voice of someone who had litigated 15 years of water disputes and could not afford to speak slowly. She read the deed herself, with her reading glasses on, and then she set it on the desk and looked at me. "Your uncle filed this in 1981, she said. "The Strickland Jr. appropriations were recorded in 1992. In a shortage year, and this is a shortage year, your rights take precedence, every gallon." I nodded. She pulled the relevant California water code sections from her shelf without looking at the shelves, which told me she had done this before. She said she would need to obtain the transaction documents to understand the full scope of what the conglomerate's purchase plan required. I mentioned page 31. She wrote it down. I left the certified copy of the deed on her conference table and drove back to Kingsburg. On the drive back, I thought about the scale of the miscalculation. Have you ever watched someone make a decision with incomplete information and known, from the outside, exactly what they were missing? Have you ever been in a room where the most important document was not on the table? Because it was on a shelf at your house? Because you had put it there 12 years ago and kept it correctly every year since? That is a particular kind of stillness, not smugness, just the clarity that comes from having the whole picture when someone else has half of it. Desmond had stood in that barn with a folder containing $312,000 and believed he was being generous. He had run that number past his transaction attorney and his brother and probably a few other people, and all of them had worked from the same assumption, that the water infrastructure associated with the sale parcel was uniformly his, by proximity, by marriage, by the logic of land ownership that says if you can see it from your field, you probably own it. None of them had checked the Fresno County Recorder's office. Not once in 12 years. I had maintained that record for 12 years, renewed it every year, kept it in a locked box on a shelf, and not one person in the Strickland family had ever asked what was in it. What would you have done if you had found page 31 on the shared drive 3 months before the barn meeting? Would you have said something? Would you have flagged the discrepancy, walked into the kitchen and said, "I notice the purchase agreement assumes the well field is part of your sale, and it isn't, it's mine"? I have thought about that question. My honest answer is no. Not because I was planning anything, but because the information was not mine to volunteer at that moment. It was mine to keep, accurately, until the moment when it became relevant. That moment arrived in August. It arrived because Desmond chose the barn and the folder and the pen, not me. She had the precise number within the week. Xiomara called me 7 days later with the current appraiser's figure, $3.9 million for the well field rights at senior priority water value. Confirmed by 2 independent appraisers she had engaged simultaneously. The buyer's own transaction attorney had already flagged internally that the sale price would drop by $8 million if the senior rights could not be acquired. The entire corporate purchase was structured around water that I owned. The deed in the gray metal box on the shelf of my home office was not a footnote to the Strickland sale. It was the transaction. Without it, the deal did not work at the price they had agreed to. Not at the crop scale they had planned, not in a drought year that was projected to run through the following spring. Do you know what that kind of number does to a negotiation? $8 million. The conglomerate had agreed to a purchase price built on the assumption that the water was included. When the assumption turned out to be wrong, the entire financial model for their crop plan had to be rebuilt. Their agronomists' projections depended on full-year draw from the well field. Without that draw, in a drought year, the crop rotation they had planned for the parcel was not viable at scale. They were not buying farmland with a water problem attached. They had bought a water problem, and the farmland came with it. The shift in leverage was total, and it had happened the moment Xiomara filed the notice. Xiomara filed a notice of my separate property interest in the water rights within 10 days of the barn meeting. The notice was served on Desmond's transaction attorney, a man whose firm I had seen referenced in the preliminary purchase folder, which meant he had been engaged before the barn meeting, before the divorce papers, before Desmond had spoken a single word to me in that barn. The filing was precise and formal and unambiguous. I was informed it had been received. 3 days after that, I received a call from Desmond's attorney's office requesting an urgent conference. The word urgent was used twice in the message. I passed the message to Xiomara. She scheduled the conference. The first conference was held in Xiomara's office, at the maps and records table. On a Thursday afternoon, Desmond's transaction attorney arrived with an associate and 2 binders of documents. Desmond was not present, which I noted but did not remark on. The conference lasted 3 hours. Desmond's team opened with the argument that the water rights had been, in their phrase, constructively commingled with the Strickland operation. That because the well field bordered the operation's irrigation infrastructure, and because the infrastructure had been maintained with marital funds over the years, the rights had effectively become marital property. It was the strongest argument they had, and I had expected it. Xiomara produced 12 years of Fresno County Recorder records, not summaries, the actual records, 0 cross-ownership filings, 0 shared maintenance agreements, 0 joint use records of any description. The well field had been maintained through a separate account I had funded from the deed's annual water lease income that Desmond had not known existed because I had never deposited it into a joint account and had never been asked to account for it. The commingling argument was withdrawn before the end of the first hour. Xiomara told me afterward, when we debriefed over coffee in the building's small waiting area with the afternoon sun cutting through the west-facing window, that she had handled 31 water rights priority disputes in her career, and that the commingling argument failed in almost every case where the original acquisition predated the marriage. It had not predated the marriage. I married Desmond when I was 29, and the deed came to me when I was 34, but the inheritance characterization was clear and documented. She said Desmond's team would move to a different argument. She was correct about that, and about the timeline. 2 days. The second argument arrived in written form 2 days later, a motion characterizing the deed as a marital gift. The theory being that because Ernesto had died during the marriage and the transfer had occurred while I was Desmond's wife, the asset had been gifted to the marital estate rather than to me as a separate property inheritance. Xiomara did not hurry her response. She produced Ernesto's will, the original, witnessed and notarized, which named me individually by full legal name, with no reference to my marital status. She produced the chain of title documentation, showing the transfer as a probate distribution from Ernesto's estate to my sole name. She produced a declaration from my Aunt Remedios, who described the title transfer at the county recorder's office in the kind of specific sequential detail that comes from having been present in person and having a very good memory. I want to tell you about Remedios because she deserves to be in this story properly. She was 71 years old, Ernesto's widow, and she had watched me grow up from a serious-faced child who would rather balance a checkbook than ride a bicycle, which was her phrase for me, said with affection. When I called her the day after the barn meeting and explained what was happening, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in Spanish, something that translates roughly to, "He handed you papers in a barn?" Her voice carried a quality I recognized as the calm that precedes a decision. She said she would come to Fresno whenever Xiomara needed her. She drove to Fresno 3 weeks later, in a car she had driven since 2009, wearing a blue dress and carrying a small leather purse. She sat across from Xiomara in the conference room and described the title transfer from memory, the date, the recorder's office address, the clerk's name, the document number, the sequence of signatures, everything Xiomara needed and more. Remedios had been a school secretary for 31 years. She understood documentation. She signed the declaration without hesitation and accepted the parking validation Xiomara offered and declined the coffee. She told me, in the elevator on the way down, that Ernesto had always said the well field would be worth more someday. He had been right about that, too. Was there a counter-argument Desmond's team could have made that had more traction? I have thought about this. The strongest possible argument, the one that never came, would have been to show that Desmond had contributed financially to the maintenance of the well field during the marriage, that marital funds had been used to keep it operational, that the boundary was not as clean as the records showed. That argument would have required evidence of shared expenditure. And there was no such evidence, because the well field had never cost much to maintain. The original wells were deep and reliable. The equipment was old and simple, and the annual maintenance I paid out of the lease income account was modest. Desmond had never spent $1 on the well field. He had never visited it. He had never asked about it. He had, I believe, genuinely not known it existed as a separate legal parcel with its own deed and its own Fresno County recording. That is the answer to the question you might be asking, why hadn't he looked it up? Because it had never occurred to him to look. He owned land in all directions. He assumed that everything adjacent to land he owned was land he owned. It is a common assumption. It is almost always correct. It was not correct in this case. Under California Family Code, an inheritance received by one spouse during marriage is separate property unless transmuted in writing with full disclosure to both parties. There had been no transmutation. There had been no written agreement of any kind between Desmond and me on the subject of the well field, because the subject of the well field had never been raised. Not once in 12 years. The gift characterization motion failed. Between the filing of the second motion and its failure, something shifted in the structure of the negotiation that I found instructive. The conglomerate's transaction team called Xiomara directly, not through Desmond's attorney, directly, to inquire about a potential separate easement negotiation. They wanted to understand whether the water rights could be acquired through an instrument independent of the divorce settlement. They were asking me, effectively through Xiomara, whether there was a version of this that did not require Desmond's cooperation. I thought about that for a moment when Xiomara told me. What it meant was that the conglomerate had assessed the situation and concluded that I was the party with the controlling instrument. They were right. They had been right from the day the purchase agreement draft was written. They just hadn't known it until Xiomara filed the notice. The call lasted 11 minutes, according to Xiomara's log. The conglomerate's representative was polite and efficient and made no reference to the divorce proceeding. He spoke about the easement as though it were a straightforward commercial transaction between willing parties, which, from my side of it, it was. Xiomara advised me to let the settlement process run first before engaging in any separate easement negotiation. She said the easement would be far more valuable as a term within the divorce settlement, one transaction, one set of attorneys, one conference table, than as a separate bilateral agreement that might create complications in the divorce proceeding. I agreed with her assessment. She was faster than me in all things related to the law, and I was faster than most people in all things related to the numbers, and between the two of us we understood the full picture clearly. We did not rush. There were weeks in that period that I will not fully describe because they did not involve the legal mechanics. They involved the ordinary experience of a marriage ending and what that feels like in a house you have lived in for a long time. The kitchen window that faced the irrigation pivots, the particular sounds of the place at 5 a.m, the specific understanding, arriving quietly over several evenings, that 17 years had been a thing I had built, and that it was going to have to be acknowledged, at some point, as a loss, even with the fireproof box on the shelf, even with Xiomara's voice in my ear. I want to name that plainly, because the legal precision of this story can make it sound bloodless. It was not bloodless. It was simply controlled. What I had not anticipated was the effect on the people who worked in the operation. I should have anticipated it, because I had managed payroll for 30 seasonal workers, and I understood that an operation in the middle of a complicated sale and a divorce is an operation in which no one's job feels secure. In late September, a week or so before Xiomara filed a procedural document I had been waiting on, one of the field supervisors, a man named Argueta, who had worked the eastern fields for 9 consecutive seasons and whom I had always liked for his precision about hours and his dislike of approximation, stopped me in the equipment yard. He said he had heard things were complicated. He said he hoped the people in the office were going to be all right. He meant me. He had known for 9 years that I was the one who made sure his payroll was correct, his labor compliance filings were submitted on time, and his crew's workers' compensation records were in order. He did not know the specifics of the legal situation, but he knew what the office ran on. I told him his final quarter payroll and compliance filings would be submitted accurately and on time, regardless of what else was happening. He nodded. He went back to the East Field. I went back to the office. I did not tell him how large the number in the fireproof box was. That was not his information to carry. Desmond retained a second attorney during this period, a family law specialist to handle the divorce proceeding separate from the transaction attorney, who remained engaged on the sale side. I learned about this through a formal notice of representation. The new attorney reached out to Xiomara to propose mediation prior to a formal settlement conference. Xiomara consulted me. I said the conference was fine. I did not need mediation. I had the numbers. The conference was scheduled for the 4th week of October, a full 10 weeks after the barn meeting. Those 10 weeks had not been idle. Xiomara had obtained a second independent appraisal of the wellfield rights during that interval. The figure came back at $3.91 million, essentially identical to the first appraiser's $3.92. She had also secured a water law specialist's opinion letter, confirming the senior priority status and its governing effect in the current drought year. The letter was 4 pages long and cited 8 California water code sections. She had everything she needed on the table before we walked into the room. I want you to understand how much documentation had been produced in support of a claim that rested, ultimately, on a single gray metal box that had sat on a shelf in my home office for 12 years. The box itself was not complicated. What it contained was not complicated. A deed, accurately recorded, correctly maintained, filed under my own name. Simplicity, sustained long enough, becomes permanence. I want to tell you about the appraisers because the numbers deserve their proper context. The first appraiser Xiomara engaged was a water rights valuation specialist out of Sacramento, a man who had been calculating the monetary value of senior priority rights for 22 years and who worked regularly for both sides of water disputes. He walked the well field on a Tuesday morning in September, reviewed the original 1981 drilling records and the capacity logs from every year since, and produced a written appraisal that valued the senior rights at $3.92 million based on current scarcity conditions, the projected agricultural demand from the conglomerate's crop plan, and the precedential settlement amounts in 4 comparable recent transactions he cited by name and amount. $3.92 million. The conglomerate's own internal estimate, which Xiomara had obtained through the transaction documents, was $3.9 million. The 2 figures were a rounding difference. Both of them were almost 13 times what Desmond had offered me in that folder on the tractor hood. The second appraiser Xiomara engaged for corroboration came in at 3.91. 3 independent figures from 3 different methodologies within $10,000 of one another. The well field's value was not in dispute. It was a fact, the way all figures are facts when they have been measured correctly. During that October, Xiomara had one more exchange with Desmond's transaction attorney that she relayed to me afterward. He had asked her, in a private call, whether there was any version of the settlement in which I would agree to a valuation discount on the water rights in exchange for a faster close. The question meant the conglomerate's timeline was becoming a pressure point for Desmond, that the corporate buyer was losing patience with the delay, that the price drop clock Desmond's own attorney had warned him about was running in real time, that every week the deed sat in my fireproof box was a week the deal remained in limbo. Xiomara said she had relayed the question to me. I said no. She called him back. He said he understood. The conversation was 3 sentences long, fast, like everything Xiomara did. What I thought about, after she told me, was Desmond's face in the barn, the surprise, the pen still extended. He had not prepared for no in August. He was still not prepared for it in October. That consistency told me something about the kind of negotiator he was, and confirmed everything I already knew about the kind of negotiator I was. During those same weeks, I kept doing my job. The Strickland operations accounts payable did not stop because the marriage had. I managed the final quarter payroll for the seasonal workers, submitted the October crop insurance reconciliation, and filed the year-end USDA compliance report. The last one I would file for that operation, as it turned out, though I did not know the exact timing at the time. I did the work correctly and completely, the way I had always done it. The fact that the work benefited an operation whose owner had handed me a folder in a barn and expected me to accept $312,000 was not relevant to the quality of the work. Numbers are numbers. Accuracy is accuracy. I did not introduce errors. There was one afternoon during those weeks when Hector came to the Kingsburg house unannounced. He knocked at the back door, not the front, which was his custom. He stood on the step in the September heat. The valley was still running above 90 degrees, even mid-month, and said he wanted to talk, that Desmond had asked him to come, that the family hoped this could be resolved without things becoming complicated. He said the word family twice. I stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. The same man who had made that sound in the barn, the quiet, brief laugh when I hadn't reached for the pen. I told him I had an attorney and that all communications should go through her. He said something about things not needing to go this far. I said Xiomara's full name and her office phone number clearly, so he could write them down if he wanted to. He did not write them down. He said something else about the family's hopes for a clean resolution. I said, all communications through my attorney. The third time, he heard it. He left. The door closed behind him. I went back to the accounts payable and finished the column I had been working on. The settlement conference was held on the 28th of October at a corporate law firm near the Fresno airport, a firm retained by the conglomerate to manage the transaction side. The room was large, with a long, polished table and windows that faced west, toward the valley interior and the flat pale distance. Late October in the San Joaquin still carries heat in the afternoon. Not August heat, but a warm residual light that comes through glass at an angle and makes the air in a conference room feel denser than it is. The conglomerate's transaction attorney was present, which confirmed that the purchase and the divorce had become a single negotiation, whether Desmond's team had intended that or not. Desmond sat across the table with his 2 attorneys. Hector was present as well, at one end of the table, which I had not expected. He was wearing a jacket. I noticed he did not look at me when I came in. Xiomara set the certified copy of the deed in the center of the table. She did not make a statement about doing so. She simply placed it there, the way you place a fact where it belongs, in the middle, in full view, where everyone in the room can see it. The conglomerate's transaction attorney picked it up. He read it once, he set it down. He picked it up again and read it a second time. He set it down and looked at Desmond. Desmond looked at the appraiser's report, which Xiomara had placed next to the deed. His family law attorney said something about goodwill. The word goodwill sat in the air for a moment without anyone responding to it. Xiomara said the Wellfield valuation was $3.9 million as confirmed separate property, confirmed by 2 independent appraisers, and corroborated by the conglomerate's own internal estimate, and that a perpetual easement agreement was the only instrument that would allow the sale to close. She said this at her usual speed, without performance, without pause, every syllable audible. Desmond looked at the appraiser's report for a long time. The room was very quiet. The air conditioning ran. Outside the windows, the Fresno afternoon carried that late October angle of light across the valley flat. He did not speak for what I estimated to be 40 seconds. I sat with my hands folded on the table and watched him, and felt nothing in particular, or rather, felt the specific flatness that comes when you have been carrying a weight for a long time and the carrying is almost done. Then he looked up. But he did not look at me. He looked somewhere past my left shoulder, toward the window, at the valley light. He said, "What does she want?" His voice was even. He said it as though I were not in the room, which I think was the only way he could manage it. Hector, at the far end of the table, did not move, did not speak, did not make any sound at all. Xiomara said, "I'll read you the terms." She opened her folder. She began. The settlement closed in March of the following year. The water rights deed was confirmed as my separate property. $3.9 million, non-marital under California Family Code, with 2 independent appraisals and a judicial confirmation of the chain of title entering the record. The conglomerate executed a perpetual easement agreement, whose terms Xiomara had negotiated over 6 weeks of drafts and counter-drafts following the October conference. Under the easement, they obtained the right to draw from the well field for agricultural use in perpetuity, and I retained ownership, and received an annual maintenance payment as rights holder, a figure structured to adjust with the regional water pricing index, which in a drought year is a number worth watching. Desmond's sale to the conglomerate closed on schedule, at a price that reflected the easement terms. I kept the Kingsburg house, valued at $675,000. The spousal support was structured over 7 years. The total flowing to me from the deed valuation, the easement terms, the house, and the support came to approximately $5.05 million in exchange for 17 years and the deed that Ernesto had left me in a simple, correctly witnessed will, which I had maintained accurately for 12 years in a gray metal box with a combination lock on the second shelf of the home office. Hector did not speak at the settlement conference. He did not speak in the parking lot afterward. I did not see him again. I moved to Fresno that spring, a smaller place than the Kingsburg house with a kitchen window that faces a neighbor's garden rather than irrigation pivots, and a home office that is slightly too warm in the afternoons but adequately sized. I unpacked the fireproof box on the first day and put it on the shelf in the new office. The deed is still in it, along with 12 years of renewal confirmations and the settlement documentation. I closed the lid. I set the combination. It is in the correct place, filed under the correct category, which is still my own name. The barn in Kingsburg is on land whose sale could not close without my agreement. That is simply a fact, the way all correctly recorded things are facts. Desmond will run other operations, on other land. Ernesto's well field will continue to produce water for the cotton fields under the easement terms. The pivots will run. The valley will be pale gold in August and flat and bright and 104 degrees by noon. None of that changes. What changed is the name on the deed, and the name on the deed was always mine. I lost a family, in the way that divorce always costs you a family. Not just the husband, but the extended structure of people who organized their understanding of you around the marriage rather than around you. That is a cost I named once to Xiomara in her office on an afternoon when the settlement documents were spread across the conference table and the air conditioning was running and there was nothing left to dispute. She nodded. She did not offer a consolation. That was the right response. Read every page. Know what your name is on, especially the page that nobody else thought to read. Desmond handed me a folder with a number on the cover sheet. He had not read the correct document. He did not know there was another number in another box on another shelf that had been waiting there for 12 years in my sole name. The offer was more than fair, he had said. He was right about that. It was more than fair. He had simply miscalculated which of us was making it. Tell me in the comments, would you have said something in that barn? Or would you have waited? Share this story with someone who knows the value of reading every page. And thank you, as always, for listening.